I don't know about you, but as I was singing that song, something was stirring in my heart. I was really loving singing about the cross of Jesus. Those words, the precious cross, the blood that was spilled for us. It should just invigorate us, shouldn't it? It should just push us on to want to strive for Jesus in all that we do.
Amen. Yeah.
But unfortunately, we become familiar with the cross.
Yeah.
It becomes a wooden object on the side of the stage. It becomes a gold cross around our necklace. As we look to Jesus and the cross, it becomes so familiar that it loses its glory and greatness in our life. And you see, when we no longer behold the cross in all its glory and goodness, we start to fall asleep in our faith. We start to grow weary and tired. We start to wonder, if only God would show up powerfully at some point in my life and reinvigorate my faith and my service for Him. You know, maybe if He just appeared on the end of my bed one night, then I would be sold out for Him. That's what I'm waiting for. But unfortunately, that's not what happens. God has revealed Himself to us through His Word. He has already appeared to us in Jesus Christ and done what needs to be done on the cross.
Amen.
But when we become lazy in our faith and we become almost dead in our faith, symptoms start to show. Maybe for you, the symptom that you are not beholding the cross in all its glory is that you have an unforgiving heart towards other people. That you can't forgive people when they wrong you, or you can't forgive someone who wronged you 10 years ago. That's because we do not behold the cross of Christ. Maybe it's because you can't forgive yourself. Maybe that's the symptom in your life. If you cannot forgive yourself for past sins and actions, then maybe you are not truly beholding Jesus and His cross. Maybe you've lost your vigor for evangelism. You no longer care about sharing the gospel with the world because your love for the world has grown cold. That's a symptom of no longer beholding the cross of Christ. So what we are going to see tonight is that the only way to truly come alive in our faith, as we're looking in this series at the end of Luke, come alive in your faith, is to truly behold Jesus. Not just tonight, not just a new beholding, a new looking, a new refreshing tonight of Jesus, not just next Sunday, not even just in your morning quiet times. Every moment of every day, Jesus and His cross should be in our hearts and in our minds, and it should permeate the way that we live our life. Through this series, last week we saw how Jesus was betrayed. So if you want to open your Bibles to Luke chapter 23, we're going to continue in our series in the Gospel of Luke. In chapter 22, we saw that Jesus was betrayed by Judas and arrested in the dead of night. Peter denies Him. All the disciples have left Jesus and scattered. Jesus is then mocked and beaten. And then He's presented before the council, the elders of Israel, the religious elite. And they start accusing Him and asking Him questions. And we see that He gives them an answer that they don't want to hear. They ask Him, "Are you the Christ? Why don't you tell us?" He says, "If I tell you, you will not believe, and if I ask you, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man shall be seated at the right hand of the power of God." And that was all they needed to hear. Now they knew what they wanted to do. They needed to kill Jesus. He blasphemed the holy God because they didn't understand who He truly was. They looked on Jesus. They saw all the works that He had done. But there was hate in their heart. There was self-preservation in their heart. There was pride in their heart. But unfortunately, the religious leaders couldn't kill Jesus on their own. So that's where we come to Luke chapter 23. The religious elite bring Jesus to Pilate. in verse 21, we read this. Chapter 23, verse 1. We read this. Then the whole company of them arose and brought him before Pilate. So that's the religious leaders, the scribes and the Pharisees and the priests. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation, forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king." Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered, "You have said so." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no guilt in this man." But they were urgent, saying, "He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea and Galilee, even to this place." See, Pilate is the only one that can condemn Jesus to death. So the religious leaders bring him forward, and they bring 3 charges: misleading the nation, forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king. Well, Pilate doesn't even care about the first 2, and we know that the first 2 are false anyway. He's not misleading a nation. In fact, if anything, he's the true shepherd, as he talks about in John, who is leading the nation in the right way, in the true way. Is he forbidding to give tribute to Caesar? By no means. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, but render unto God what is God's. You see, these religious leaders are so blind to who Jesus is that they have to make things up just to have him killed. Then finally, he himself is saying that he is Christ, a king. And this is all that Pilate cares about. Because if Jesus is claiming to be king and he is a king over a kingdom, then that means he is against Caesar and against the Roman government and against Pilate. And that's something very serious that he has to take. But as he questions him, Jesus responds, "You have said so." Now, it's a little bit of a confusing response that Jesus gives him. But basically what Jesus is saying is he's affirming what Pilate has said. You have said so, but not in the sense that you are thinking. I am king over the Jews, but not in an earthly sense like you are worried about. I'm actually king over the whole world. Now, obviously, he doesn't say that to Pilate, but this is what we can understand through the text and through the context. So Pilate declares that Jesus is innocent. He finds no guilt in this man. But as he hears that he's been teaching throughout Judea and Galilee, Pilate asks whether he was a Galilean. Now he sees his way out. He sees that there are these religious leaders who are falsely accusing Jesus and have no grounds for murder charges. And he sees Jesus, an innocent man. What is he going to do? Oh, I know. Oh, so he's under Herod's jurisdiction. I'll just handball him off to him. He can deal with it. I don't want to deal with it. There's an innocent man who has been laid to be, who they want to be killed, yet he doesn't want to do it. So verse 7, he says, "And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him over to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had long desired to see him, because he had heard about him, and he was hoping to see some sign done by him. So he questioned him at some length, but he made no answer. The chief priests and the scribes stood by vehemently accusing him. And Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. Arraying him in splendid clothing, he sent him back to Pilate. And for some reason, Herod and Pilate became friends that day with each other." The whole reason that Luke is including the story of Herod is because it is adding to Jesus' case. You see, as we read through verse 13, Pilate then called them all back, the chief priests and the rulers and all the people, and he said to them, "You brought me this man, one who was misleading the people. And after examining him, I have examining him before you, behold, I did not find this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither did Herod." So we see now Pilate and Herod both agree that this man is innocent. Nothing deserving of death has been done by him. But yet, they all cried out together, "Away with this man and release to us Barabbas." So we see that Pilate and Herod have both declared Jesus is innocent. And there is an injustice being done here. And the injustice is that these religious leaders are still wanting Jesus dead, even though 2 rulers have declared his innocence. So they said, "Away with this man, release to us Barabbas." Well, an interesting note, the name Barabbas translates to son of the father. Son of the father. Very interesting. We'll come back to that later. But just remember that. Barabbas, son of the father. Now here's a man who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection started in the city and for murder. Here is the irony in this passage. They bring Jesus falsely accused of rebellion, misleading the people, claiming to be a king. But release to us the man who actually did rebel. Again, Pilate begins to see the irony. He sees the deceit in the eyes of these religious leaders. And he goes, and he says to them, verse 20, desiring to release Jesus. But they kept shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." And a third time he said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found no guilt in him deserving death." Still again, Pilate tries to release Jesus because he can see the injustice that is happening here. You see, these religious people don't care about rebellion and who's their king and all that nonsense. All they want is Jesus gone. And Pilate sees that. Verse 23, but they were urgent, demanding with loud cries that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate decided that their demands should be granted. Pilate was concerned with the innocence of Jesus, but when it became too hard for him, he became more concerned with himself and self-preservation. So he released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, for whom they asked, but he delivered Jesus over to their will. You see, this section is all about the substitution of Jesus. In this section, Luke is wanting us to behold the substitution of Jesus. Now, what that means is that here we have Barabbas, whose name means son of the Father, and we have Jesus, who is son of God, son of the true Father. We have a guilty son of the Father and an innocent son of the Father, and the innocent one takes the place of the guilty. This is the substitution of Jesus. This is the penal substitutionary atonement of Jesus, if you want a big theological term. What that is saying is that Jesus took the punishment that Barabbas deserved. That's the substitutionary atonement of Jesus, and this is what we are to behold. We are the sons of the Father, the guilty sons of God, who have gone astray, who have rebelled against Him, who have murdered in our hearts with the hatred that we have, and yet the innocent, righteous, true Son of God steps in and takes our place. If you want to truly live life in all its fullness, if you want to come alive in your faith, you need to behold the substitution of Jesus. You need to behold this story that we are Barabbas, found guilty on all charges, on the road to the crucifixion, ready to die, and Jesus steps in. The substitution of Jesus. Paul picks up on this understanding in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. And he says this, chapter 5, verse 14, "For the love of Christ controls us, because we have concluded this, that one, being Jesus, has died for all, therefore all have died. And he died for all, that those who live might no longer live for themselves, but for him who for their sake died and was raised." You see, Jesus died for us so that we might live for him. That is what substitution means for us. When we behold the substitution of Jesus, we understand that his death for us means that we can live for him. And if you want life in all its fullness, it's living a life for Jesus. But in this passage, Luke is not just wanting us to look at the actions and what Jesus is doing, but he wants us to peek behind the curtain and see the heart of Jesus in this passage. You see, as they lead Jesus away, a great crowd followed them. And in that great crowd, there was women who were mourning and lamenting for him. You see, these women understood the innocence of Jesus here. They could see the injustice that was happening, that an innocent man was dying for a guilty man, that an innocent man was dying for no reason. But what we see here is that Jesus' heart is not concerned for himself, but concerned for those who are mourning. In verse 28, he says, turning to them, he says, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore and the breasts that never nurse. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, to the hills, cover us. For if they do these things when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?" Basically, what Jesus is saying is that a great destruction is coming upon you because of your rejection of me. We looked at that a couple of weeks ago. The destruction of the temple was coming as judgment on Israel. There was a future short-term temporal judgment coming. And what Jesus was saying was, when you see that, remember my words and turn back to me. That's Jesus' heart for them, is that he is warning them of the forthcoming destruction so that when it happens, they would be aware that Jesus is their king. But not just that. You see, that is looking to this short-term temporal judgment, but that means nothing for us. That was AD 70. That was a long time ago. Jesus is also speaking of the great white judgment, the great throne judgment, where he will judge the whole world. And you see, Jesus' heart is not that he will just leave us to our own devices. He does not leave the very people who are crucifying him to their own devices. He warns them because he loves them and he cares for them. And even more than that, as he was raised up on the cross, he says to them in verse 34, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing." And he says that in the midst of the leaders saying this, "He has saved others, let him save himself. If he is the Christ of God, his chosen one." And the soldiers mocked him. "If you are the King of the Jews, save yourself." In the midst of the crucifixion, in the midst of the mockery, he says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." If we are to live life in all its fullness, we need to behold the heart of Jesus. We need to behold that in the midst of his greatest suffering and trial, he was still concerned for the ones doing it, not for himself. Now, when Jesus says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do," he is not clearing their guilt of what they are doing. He's not saying just because they don't fully understand means that they're not guilty for the charges for crucifying him. He is offering them a way of forgiveness. He is revealing to us his heart. In Romans 5, 6-8, "For while we were still weak, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly." That's you and that's me. "For one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would dare even to die. But God shows his love for us, and that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." That is the love of Christ. That is the heart that we are to behold if we are to live life in all its fullness. To truly come alive, we need to not only behold the action of the substitution of Jesus, but we need to behold the heart that sits behind the acts of the substitution of Jesus. Now, as we come to the two criminals, there's a theme that has been running through this passage: the innocence of Jesus. Pilate declared it 4 times. In verse 4, "I find no guilt in him." In verse 14 and 15, "I find no guilt in him, nothing deserving of death." Verse 22, "What evil has he done? I find in him no guilt deserving death." Jesus is innocent in all that is happening here. But as we come to the criminal, we see something far greater. we see that a criminal who looks on the innocence of Jesus has a different response. You see, Herod and Pilate both still had a self-centered response. They saw the innocence of Jesus, but all they cared for was himself. So let's read on from verse 39. One of the criminals who were hanged railed at him, saying, "Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence and condemnation? And we," that's talking about himself and the other criminal, "indeed justly. For we are receiving the due rewards of our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong." Do you see the difference between Pilate and this criminal? The criminal understands his guilt. You see, when he beholds the innocence of Jesus, when he looks into the innocent face of Jesus, he understands that he is supposed to be there. He is the one who's supposed to be on that cross, not Jesus. Jesus is innocent. I'm guilty. That is the response when we behold the innocence of Christ. It removes any pride in our life when we behold the innocence of Christ. When we do it with our sin in the forefront. When we behold Jesus' innocence and our guilt in the same sphere, it removes any pride from our life. So to truly come alive in your life, you need to behold the substitution of Jesus, behold the heart of Jesus, behold the innocence of Jesus. And finally, we need to behold the death of Jesus. Verse 44. It was now about the 6th hour, and there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour, while the sun's light failed. So from noon until 3 o'clock, darkness had come across the earth. Creation was beholding Jesus. Right here, creation understood what was happening. That the Word who was in the beginning, who created all things, was now being hanged on a cross for the sake of the world. Darkness fell. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus, calling out with a loud voice, said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And having said this, he breathed his last. The reason that the curtain had been torn in two was because God looked on his Son, the substitutionary atonement of Jesus, and he said, "I accept this pleasing sacrifice." No longer do you have to go through the sacrifices and rituals of the Levitical system to come to God. The curtain was torn because God's presence had gone out. Because the access was no longer veiled. The access was no longer through the temple. The access is now through Jesus alone. And we all have access to him through Jesus. God said, "Thank you, my Son. Now the world has been reconciled to me." No longer will they have to work and strive. No longer will they have to bring lambs without blemish. They can come through his Son. Jesus made the impossible possible. You see, true life can only happen because of the death of Jesus. Not just beholding the death of Jesus, but because of the death of Jesus, true life is now possible. And that is why we need to behold it every moment of our lives. So you'll begin to live a life in all its fullness when you behold the substitution of Jesus, the heart of Jesus, the innocence of Jesus, and the death of Jesus. Now, at the beginning of the sermon, I talked about some of the symptoms for us as Christians when we fall asleep in our faith. When we're not living life in all its fullness, there are symptoms that come along with that. Sometimes we wait on God to reveal himself in a supernatural way before we respond to him or follow after him. We have an unforgiving heart towards ourselves and towards others. We live a life full of pride and self-reliance, self-centeredness and self-preservation. And a life that is not truly living is one that does not share the gospel. If you are not sharing the gospel, then maybe you are not living life to all its fullness. So let me explain to you now how beholding Jesus all the time can not only solve these problems, but remove these barriers so you can start living life in all its fullness. So, the first one. You do not need God to show up in physical form or in a supernatural, powerful way in your life, because Jesus did it for us on the cross over 2,000 years ago. All we need to do is behold Jesus to move beyond the point of expecting God to come in and somehow magically work powerfully in my life. If I'm not feeling it with reading my Bible, I'm not feeling it with praying, I'm not waiting for a zap from God to reinvigorate myself, I need only behold Jesus and come back to Him and see again the beauty and glory and greatness of Jesus and His cross. And you will truly come alive. What about forgiving others? Well, when we look to the cross, we see that the payment of sin has been paid for by Jesus on the cross. So when someone sins against me, I can forgive them because I know Jesus has dealt with their sin. If that is a Christian who has sinned against me, then the payment for that sin has been made by Jesus. So I can offer forgiveness freely to my fellow Christians. I do not need to hold them against any high standard. I do not need to hold bitterness in my heart towards other Christians because Jesus paid their penalty as well as mine. I can offer forgiveness because of the death of Jesus. But what if they're a non-Christian? Well, the Bible teaches that if Jesus doesn't pay the punishment for you, then you are going to pay the punishment for yourself. So I can actually offer forgiveness to non-Christians who sin against me because I know that one day, if they do not accept Jesus, they will pay the punishment for that sin. When we look on the cross, that is what we see. And we can offer forgiveness freely to anyone, no matter what the crime is. What about for yourself? Well, again, it's very similar. If you are choosing not to forgive yourself for past sins, you do not truly believe that the sacrifice of Jesus is enough. And you're holding yourself up to a higher standard than God holds you. You're saying that I am a judge higher than God because God has looked upon you and said, because of the blood of Christ, I forgive you. So now forgive yourself. You see, bitterness and hatred in our life because we do not forgive others, and guilt weighing on our shoulders stops us from living a life in all its fullness. So behold Jesus, behold the cross, and understand that through that you can offer forgiveness freely to others and to yourself. Understanding the substitution of Jesus is the way to reinvigorate your passion for the gospel. When we understand the substitution of Jesus, as we saw in Corinthians before, Jesus died for me so that I might live for Him. When we see the substitution of Jesus, it should invigorate us for the gospel and invigorate us for evangelism, because we understand that every time I walk out those doors, my life is not my own. Every time I wake up on Monday morning and Tuesday morning, my life is not my own. He died for me so that I could live for Him. So step out in faith. Do not worry about the world. Your life is not your own. Jesus has you, and Jesus has done it for you. You know, sometimes in the Christian community and in the Christian circles, we hold each other up to really high standards. And so when they fail, we see it okay to get bitter and angry and not forgive them because they're Christians, they should know better. Well, when we look on the innocence of Jesus and see our guilt and our sin, we should understand that the person sitting next to us in this pew is exactly the same. That the person sitting next to me, I should not expect them to be perfect because I am not. That it's okay when people let you down. even if they're Christians. That it's okay if they make mistakes because they're not Jesus. Each one of us are imperfect in the face of Jesus and imperfect in general. So when we look and behold Jesus' innocence, we can live in a Christian community where people make mistakes because we understand that we are exactly the same. So I'm going to invite the band back up now as we sing our final song. And I wonder where you're at tonight. I wonder which one of those issues is holding you back from living life in all its fullness. I wonder as we sing this song, what is it of Jesus that you need to behold? Do you need to behold the substitution of Jesus tonight? The heart of Jesus, His love and compassion for us and for the entire world? The innocence of Jesus and our guilt and our imperfections in the reflection of that innocence? Or do you need to sit and behold the cross of Christ and the death of Christ? You see, as we sing this song, that is the opportunity for you tonight. But not just to behold it here, right now, tonight, but to walk out this door and behold it as you're eating pizza outside. To behold it as you go to work in the morning. To behold it as you uni students are sitting around bored because you're all done with your study. Behold the cross of Christ. Behold Jesus. And you will move from a faith that is asleep or dead, and you'll come alive. Because Jesus has made you alive through His death on the cross.